Welcome to Your Pennsylvania Ancestors. This is Denise Allen of PAAncestors.com. Today's topic is one that goes beyond Pennsylvania's borders and is all about ancestors of all times and places. When looking at your ancestors' lives, what questions do you ask yourself as you go through their records? Do you ever consider that an ancestor may have been gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender? It crossed my mind over my years of research, but I didn't know who to ask or what to look for in the records. Stewarts Blandón Traiman is my guest this week, and one of his research specialties is LGBTQ genealogy. Stewart is going to start with defining terms for us, and then tell us the clues to look for in the records. He'll also touch on archives and how to write up our ancestors' stories. He includes a list of books on gay history, and I've put those in the show notes, so don't worry about trying to write down the titles and the authors as you listen. Just enjoy the episode, and then look at the show notes for links to everything. And now, here's Stewart. Stewart Traiman, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited. We connected just randomly through the internet, and now we get to connect virtually through the internet to record the podcast. And you're a genealogist, you're in California, and can you introduce yourself and just share how you got started in genealogy and what your interest is? Because I'm excited for the listeners to hear what you're about.
Okay. Well, Thank you very much, Denise. And I am Stewart Blandón Traiman, and I am a genealogist. And you can find me and more information about me at 6gen.org. That's my website. And I've been doing genealogy for greater than 30 years. Started off when I was a teen. I remember just being interested. Well, actually, I started genealogy way before then. I started genealogy in grade school. I remember reading my Bible in Catholic school. I would highlight all the begats in the book of Genesis. It's like, I didn't know at the time that was genealogy, but it really interested me to see this line of people through this ancient book. But then more when I was a teen, I started interviewing my mom and my grandmother and my great-grandmother, who was still alive at the time, about, well, who are we? Where did we come from? And who's that? And who's that cousin? And who are these pictures of? And that really got me started in genealogy. And again, I'm not sure that I even had a name for it at that time, other than just knowing that I was very interested in piecing all of these things together. Then I met my husband in 1990. And I started on Jewish genealogy because as he says, his DNA is completely boring because he's 98% Ashkenazi Jew. And they're from Ukraine and from Poland. And so I did as much as I could with US records and what's online and interviewing his cousins, interviewing his mom, interviewing anyone who's available. I sent out questionnaires to his relatives around the country and got some responses back. And so that started me on that path of doing more genealogy. Then we had children. We had a son in 1999 and a daughter in 2005. And I have traced both of their lines. My son is a Mayflower, and my daughter is back to Massachusetts 1600, but I can't quite connect her to Mayflower yet. And someday I'm going to find out that my son and my daughter are 15th cousins twice removed or something. So
that would be wonderful.
Yeah, someday. More research, more time. And so one of my interests is definitely LGBTQ genealogy. That's the primary topic that I want to talk about today, is when you're looking in your family tree and you find that bachelor uncle or that spinster aunt, I want to have people think that they're not necessarily unlucky in love, that they very possibly had a partner, had a relationship, but their relationship is not documented because we didn't have gay marriage or domestic partnership at the time, or their family didn't choose to pass down that story. You know, Uncle Bob and his friend we don't talk about them. So those stories are lost. But I want to talk about in LGBTQ genealogy, I want to talk about looking at the record and finding those clues that raises that rainbow flag in your mind that this person may be LGBTQ.
I love that term, raise the rainbow flag. I saw it on your website and it just is such a visual for me that I know now, like when I'm looking at records and I'm thinking in my head as you're talking about those single people who went well into adulthood single and died single. And according to the records, I'm looking at them like now, rainbow flag. So can you tell me what first define for the audience, because we have listeners all over the place, all over the world, all different ages. And I think these days our culture is changing so quickly and there's so much language added, for folks, that it's hard to keep up with, honestly. So just define for us what all the initials LGBTQ.
Great.
What exactly is each of those, and it's sexual orientation? Is that the correct?
Right. It's a person's sexual orientation. It's
Okay.
sexual orientation and gender identity. Those are separate things, and we'll talk about both of them. Let's start with L, lesbian, a woman who is sexually attracted to other women. Very simple. And we're going to be talking about what women mean, what men mean, what that gender identity is as well. Gay generally refers to a man attracted to another man, but gay can also just mean women attracted to women as well. You'll often hear Ellen DeGeneres refer to herself as a gay woman. There's bisexual, a person of either gender, of either sex, I should say, who is attracted to another person of either sex. And I'm also going to qualify that right there where I say either, because there are more than two sexes. There is transgender, a person who was identified at birth as female or male, and now identifies themselves in a different gender. So not the gender that they were assigned at birth. And that's a new terminology that you're going to be hearing a lot more of, is assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth. And it's sort of a, if I could say, an up and coming term. There's an older term called transsexual, and that's a term that's out of favor. We really talk about transgender folk now.
Okay. And then don't leave off the last letter, Q.
Right. And then there's Q,
Okay.
which is queer, questioning. Questioning meaning a person who really is still trying to figure out what their sexuality is. Who are they attracted to? So that's the questioning part. But then there's queer, and I love queer. I love the term queer. I use it a lot because for me, it's a catch-all. Yes, there are people who are lesbian, there are people who are gay, there are people who are transgender, but then there's people who are different. They don't fit into those boxes and those categories, yet they're still part of our community. And so for me, queer is a catch-all. Queer is also a reclaiming of a word that was used to hurt us, that slur. But now we've reclaimed it and we wear it with pride and say, I'm queer. And I love that about that word. And in the gay community, sort of to use a generic term, the gay community, the LGBT community is very good at reclaiming things like that.
Yeah, I love that reclaiming too. And I like how that one letter can be two different things. So I learned a lot, okay, in that explanation.
So let me also
Yeah.
throw out a few other terms. So a non-binary person is someone who doesn't identify in a binary way, in either male or female. They don't identify in as being heterosexual or homosexual. They are gender fluid. There's another term for you. And they are sex fluid, in meaning that they are attracted to whomever they're attracted to. They're going to be in a relationship, and they're not going to define that as being a straight relationship, a gay relationship, or themselves as either being male or female. Then in the transgender category, we have FTM and MTF, which is male to female and female to male. With the word transgender, meaning a change in gender, there's a chemistry term that is the opposite of trans, which is cis. If you remember that way back from high school chemistry, there are cis molecules and trans molecules, depending on how they're oriented. And so that's where the term cis comes from, referring to a person who was assigned male at birth and now also identifies as male. I am a cis male. I was identified at birth as male, and I still identify as male. So I am cis.
You answered the question I wanted to ask, which was around that term cis, because I've seen that and had no idea, honestly, what it meant. I was like, why? I mean, I got from the context what it meant, but I didn't understand where it came from. So thank you for explaining that.
Happy to.
When you talk about people fitting into boxes, as we as genealogists look at those boxes, right? So we look at forms have boxes, people pick a gender, people pick a race, people pick, their age, apparently, a lot of the times too. And everything that you said, we're not going to find on a form, right? Like that, maybe in contemporary forms, now they've been adapted, but not previous forms. So how would we know, genealogists, that this person is LGBTQ? Okay.
So that's the gist of my presentation.
That's great.
And I put this presentation together inspired by Judy Russell, who I heard speak at FGS, I think it was 2017. And in her presentation, she was really calling for diversity in genealogy. And, it's not just about New England. Let's start talking about everybody else. Again, with her presentation, I was just inspired to, well, I can talk about LGBTQ genealogy and LGBTQ people in history. And so I was able to put this together, and I've been giving this presentation at the California Genealogical Society, and I've given this presentation twice at Ancestry.com, and I'll be giving this presentation at the Kentucky Genealogical Society's virtual conference coming up next month in August. So I'm glad that there's interest in this topic. So what I talk about in my presentation is looking at the clues in the record and looking with a different lens, a rainbow prism, if you will, that you're just going to have that awareness that this person may not have been heterosexual. Let's not assume that everyone in the past was heterosexual, because they absolutely were not. When you see a census record and you see husband or head of house, which is generally a male, and then the wife comes in the second line, it says wife, and then there's the kids. Okay, there's certainly an assumption of heterosexuality there, but maybe not. So the example that I give in my presentation is about Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne. It is documented in Herman Melville's biography that these two men had a romantic friendship. How far that romance went, nobody knows. We never will know, but they definitely had a romantic friendship. Yet we find them in the census, both of them living with their wives and their children, which gives that assumption of heterosexuality. And yet these men had a relationship with each other. Herman Melville dedicated Moby Dick to Nathaniel Hawthorne, which also brings up the point of presentism. What did these two men consider each other? Sexuality, especially homosexuality, though it wasn't acceptable, it was less frowned upon. People could enter into same-sex relationships without as much of a stigma as we had in the 50s and 60s. So before the 1930s, there was a little bit more acceptance of people entering into same-sex relationships. Not that it was ever condoned, but it was more acceptable. You can find literature on this in lots of different scholarly works. One of the resources that I'm thinking about is called Love Stories, Sex Between Men Before Homosexuality. It's written by Jonathan Ned Katz. And so in his book, he talks about that exactly. I mean, as the title says, sex between men before homosexuality. And homosexuality is a term coined in 1876. But before that, certainly men were having sex with men. And what did that look like? So back to the point of presentism, right now we enjoy gay marriage. We have our committed relationships. We're having an unprecedented acceptance in society that's really changed dramatically in the last 50 years since the Stonewall riots in the United States. But we can't apply our same thinking, acceptance, inclusion of LGBTQ people to the past. They lived in a different time and they had a different way of managing their relationships.
I think out of everything you said, you gave me a little hope that maybe these folks that I see in my own research stayed single. I always felt bad that maybe they were lonely their whole life. So maybe
Right.
you gave me some hope that maybe they weren't lonely, that maybe they did have relationships that just weren't allowed by law,
Mhm.
and it maybe not acceptable to the neighbors, let's say, or
Right.
something, so that gave me some hope. And you're giving me, I don't know, due to the nature, like their financial status. I mean, I don't think I'll ever find thing in an archive like a journal or letters,
Mhm.
from these folks. So
Well, that'd
how
be
would I look for a
fantastic, though.
clue? Give me an example of some record I could use
Sure.
that maybe would help me with my lonely, what I thought of as the lonely people.
The Lonely
Um,
Hearts Club.
yeah.
So there's lots of records, and I want to go through all the different examples I give. First, I talk about photographs, and I show a lot of photographs throughout the presentation that I've taken from a blog called homohistory.org. And the person who runs that blog has been collecting photos for many years, and he posts them, which shows a historic LGBTQ presence. So I ask people to look at these photos in a different way, and you can look at your family photos in a different way. Were they just pals? Were they just chums in those photographs? Or can you interpret there's something else going on given their body language, given the way they're looking at each other? Is it possible that there is something other than just being friends? I talk about census records where you want to start tracing family members, which we all do already. It's like we want to find them in the 1940 census, the 1930 census, the 1920 census, and so forth. Well, are you also finding that Uncle Bob and his friend were in the 1940 census, but then Uncle Bob and his friend were also in the 1930 census? And Uncle Bob and his friend were also in the 1920 census? Well, that's curious. Uncle Bob had a friend for over 20 years and they lived together. That's a big clue right there. What was that relationship? Were they just pals and chums that found it easier to share rent? Or was there something else going on between those two men? In the census, we also find the term partner. It absolutely has been used throughout the 20th century census records. And you'll find it from time to time. And I give some examples of that. But partner meant to the enumerators was if two or more persons who are not related by blood or marriage share a common dwelling unit as partners, write head for one and partner for the other or others. And that's a okay definition. And I've seen it in census records where two women living together, one is head, the other one is partner. We see that in the record of Randolph Scott and Cary Grant when they were living together for 12 years in what the studios called Bachelor Hall. Their 1940 census record has head for one and partner for the other. We take the evidence that we find in those records, we weigh it against other evidence that we know, and then we interpret, well, what does this head partner mean? The term partner has also been used for convents. And again, tracing this term of partner, I find that many times Mother Superior is the head, and the other women in the household are all named as partner. So it's not a exact way of finding LGBTQ ancestors, but it's definitely a clue to look for it.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm thinking too, Your approach has me looking back and going, what's the possibility here that I didn't think about regarding these people and their relationship, and opening something up versus shutting something down? Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yeah. Be open to that possibility instead of
Yeah.
just saying, well, that couldn't have happened. No, that's not what's going on here.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, it could have happened. Another fantastic source is newspapers, and I love old newspapers where you can fill in that family story like no other record can, because you're getting details about who they were and what they were doing at the time. But unfortunately, you're also going to see headlines in the newspapers about police raids on gay clubs and gay bars. And so these people who were arrested, put into the paddy wagon, they got their pictures posted in the newspaper, their names, their addresses posted in the newspaper, and their lives were destroyed at that time. And some of them committed suicide after such infamy, and some of them had to say goodbye to their families. Because of that, they lost their jobs. Newspapers are a fantastic resource. If you've come across that article, well, you have names. Is one of your ancestors possibly named in a police raid? It's not the best way of getting your name in the paper, but it's great for a genealogist to find that as a resource. And for those little local newspapers, you can find a bunch of those also. More and more of them are being digitized.
Mm.
And after the Stonewall riots, with the modern gay rights movement, we started seeing a lot of community newspapers, a lot of newsletters, and those are also digitized and online. Here, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we have our biggest gay paper is called the Bay Area Reporter, or the BAR, and that's 100% online. Working with the GLBTQ archives, they've been able to digitize the entire newspaper, and it's online for free. So that's a fantastic resource. So you can look through queer papers across the country, across the world even, looking for your ancestor's name.
Thank you for mentioning that, because we do have the William Way Community Center in Philadelphia, and they do have an archive. And I realized, oh yeah, they might have some digitized newspapers, because of course there were local gay newspapers in Philadelphia, and there probably were in Pittsburgh too.
So in newspapers, the other thing to look for is obituaries. And
Mm.
I love a good obituary. I just really love a good obituary that names everybody. And Blaine Bettinger actually gave me this obituary and a story about one of his aunts who lived with a woman for 38 years. And we see them in the 1915 census in New York living together, and they're both named a partner. And then in 1932, we find the obituary of one of the women, and it says that she was the intimate friend of Miss Anne Clark, who had lived with her for the past 38 years. Okay,
Wow.
what does that tell you about that relationship? They were intimate friends, and they lived together for 38 years. So I mean, it's screaming at you that this was a lesbian relationship.
It
So,
is. Wow.
mhm. And you'd look for other things like lifelong bachelor, longtime companion, devoted friend, other kinds of code words that you might find in obituaries. Because in the 21st century, you might find an obituary that says husband or wife when they're referring to a same sex couple, but you're not going to find that prior to the 21st century.
Mhm.
And so you're looking for those code words that would help define what that relationship was about. So from the obituary, you can then follow that ancestor into the cemetery. And who are they buried with? Again, before the 21st century, it is uncommon to find same-sex couples buried together, because when you're dead, it's the family who takes over, and the family may want to take you away from that person, bury you in the family plot, and they don't really acknowledge that relationship. So that relationship may not be evident in a cemetery, but then sometimes it was. So in Paris, we have Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas buried together. They share a headstone. Gertrude is on one side and Alice is on the other. That's a fantastic example. We have police records. Now, it's not very common to find police records accessible to the public. But when you do, and there are a few resources out there, when you do, look up sodomy, look up deviant as the charges that a person was facing. And there you have some evidence of homosexuality. In military records, you're going to look at the discharge paperwork. Was your ancestor discharged dishonorably? Were they given a blue discharge? What was the context in which they were discharged dishonorably? That's a fantastic clue to follow up on as to why the military felt they needed to be separated. It's only in 2000 that the don't ask, don't tell policy was finally abolished, and gays are now able to serve openly in the military. We want to look at gay neighborhoods. When you find your ancestor, where did they live? Now, gay neighborhoods is more of a 20th century phenomenon, but if they lived within the confines of the Castro district in San Francisco, well, that's a bit of a clue. Did they live in the neighborhood in Philadelphia, in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C.? Did they live in the Marais in Paris, France? All of these are known gay neighborhoods. You want to look at professions. What was the profession of your LGBTQ ancestor? For some people, it was easier to be an entrepreneur, to have a profession that was mobile. If you were caught in the newspaper at a gay club and you were fired from your job, that's a traumatic event. But if you were a hairdresser, a florist, an author, a decorator, well, it might be easier for you to just pick up and start over in another town. To be self-employed, there's no one to fire you. And then finally, this is not so much a resource, but I want to talk about archives. And you had mentioned it earlier, it would be fantastic if you could find a diary or some papers that ancestor left behind. There are fantastic resources of domestic and international LGBTQ archives. They are all over the United States. We've got some in Tucson, San Diego, West Hollywood, Chicago, New York. And then we have archives throughout the world in Holland, Canada, Toronto, Vancouver, Berlin, South Africa. So look for those LGBTQ archives, and you never know what you might find by spending some time there.
And a person would do that after they've done their original research and have some people in mind and places and times, right?
Right.
To go to the archive. Okay.
Right. And to see how they can help. And, you have a particular person in mind or a particular organization that that person belonged to, and you want to know more about those things.
Oh, I did want to ask you, can you make a recommendation for people if they want to learn the history of LGBTQ in the United States? What would be a great book or some great resources?
There are a lot of great resources. There are many, many things to read. And specifically, my latest blog, on my website, you also find my blog. I publish it monthly. And I'm taking my LGBTQ genealogy presentation and I'm serializing it over several blogs. And this month's blog was talking about our relationships long before gay marriage. And I give some examples of different books. Another Mother Tongue by Judy Grahn is a fantastic book. It's a book that I read as a young gay man that introduced me to gay history and how we have been in every culture across the world throughout time. And, in some cultures we were more revered than others. In some cultures we had more freedoms than others, but we have been there everywhere. There are other books that will help understand gay history and gay relationships. There is a book called Male Daughters, Female Husbands, Gender and Sex in African Society. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to pronounce this name very well, but it is written by Ife Amadiume. It's published in 2015 by Zed Books. And there's a book called The Zuni Man Woman that's written by Will Roscoe in 1992, and it tells the story of two-spirited people of Native American culture, men or women who I identified as, I'm going to use a modern term here, as sort of as being non-binary. And these people who could cross that gender gap and be part of both the male and the female world were revered in Native American culture. There's same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe by John Boswell, and John Boswell has written a lot about historic gay relationships. He's a great person to look up. This year, Jen Mannion published a book called Female Husbands, A Trans History. And so there are many resources that a person who's interested in finding out more can.
Yeah, that's a great list. I love it because I am a book addict. I think for genealogists to get into the time and place of their ancestors through books, I think is so important. You know, historians have done some great lifting for us in terms of giving context that we can use. So when we look at records, they make sense, you know, like in this time and place, this is how people's attitudes and thoughts and feelings.
Right.
Yeah, it makes everything line up.
It's certainly true of any kind of genealogy that you do, where you do want to understand your ancestors' history. What was going on in that town at that time? What were the attitudes about? And you want to do that for all genealogy, is trying to understand your ancestor and what they lived through. So it's no different to also want to learn about gay history and what was going on for LGBTQ people at that time, in that town, in that state, in that country at that time.
Yeah, wonderful. You have given us an extensive list of what to look for and resources that we're already looking at in most of
Right.
the time, and we're encouraging us to look at it in a different way.
Exactly.
So any final words of wisdom as we go on our journey here?
I would say this. So
Okay.
once all the documentation has been gathered, put it into the context of LGBTQ history. What was going on for queer folk at that time? Then write your ancestor's story as openly, without judgments, being aware of all of your personal filters and bias. Try to get beyond your personal filters and bias and just write that story as openly as possible. Sexuality is inherent to family history. And so being aware of non-heterosexual ancestors is no different.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
It's fun talking about all this.
Stewart, I really want to thank you for being on the podcast and just sharing with us, because, you know, I'm 52 years old, and in 52 years, the world has changed faster than I can keep up with. I consider myself pretty fast. And you walked us through, and I felt no judgment, and I felt I could ask you anything. And I hope people listening feel the same way. And I would encourage them to go to your blog, go to your presentations, you know, and really interact with you, because it sounds like you're the kind of person that they could ask any question to, and you would, judgment free.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for saying so.
Thank you again to Stewart for sharing his expertise in LGBTQ genealogy. And don't forget his website, sixgen.org, that's SIXGEN.org, and his list of history books is in the show notes. For listeners doing research in Pennsylvania, we do have the archives at the William Way LGBT Community Center in Philadelphia, and I linked that in the show notes too. Wherever you live, though, be sure to ask your local archivist for original resources and materials in their collections. Archivists are always trying to expand the audience that they serve, and making sure that they represent everyone in history. So even if you don't have a special archive just on gay history, there probably are materials in your local archive. I hope this episode has you asking even more questions as you look at your ancestors' records, and questions which have you throw out assumptions and go after additional records and read some history. It's all about taking a second look and thinking about possibilities. The last episode of Your Pennsylvania Ancestors for Season 2 is next week, and I'll be wrapping up the season with some listener questions and some special announcements. Thanks for listening. This was Denise Allen with PAAncestors.com.